I'd like to welcome you to the general election Hustings. After the high number of young voters that were present during the referendum last year, we thought it was really important to have another event that would engage with young people of Aberdeen and allow young people to ask the questions they need to make an informed decision. So here this evening, we have the Aberdeen electoral candidates from each party to debate and answer your questions. I'd like to introduce Ross Thompson from the Conservative Party, Dan Yates from the Green Party, Baden Davey from the Labour Party, Ewan Davidson from the Liberal Democrats, Callum McCaig from the Scottish National Party, and David Lansdale from the UKIP. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for coming, and look forward to hearing from you over the course of the evening. So this evening the candidates will be debate two pre-submitted questions, and then at 7:30 after a short break they'll be available to answer your live questions. So the first pre-submitted question is, how important are youth issues to you, and how will you ensure that young people's views are taken into account if you're elected? I'd like to remind the candidates that they have 2 minutes to answer the question, and later they'll have the opportunities to comment on each other's answers. So I'd like to come to Ross Thompson first, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for taking the time to come along tonight. I did the Donside by-election Hustings in 2013, and it's always great that the Youth Council's been so active in elections and engaging people in the process. In terms of myself, youth issues are really, really important. I'm delivering a leaflet which has gone out across the constituency, which actually has the backing of a 16-year-old. So not only do I have people from business and people from sport, people of other backgrounds, I've actually got a young person who's saying why he wants to vote for, well, why he would vote for me if he could, and thankfully we'll be 16, 17-year-olds will be able to vote in the next Holyrood elections. I've got a track record of working with People Voice and with the Youth Council as well to make sure we get things done. I'm the only councillor that goes along to the People Voice event, the opening event at the townhouse. I help them organise it, help them bring it together, and I engage a lot with the young people in my own community, which is Hazelhead, Ashley, Queen's Cross. I'm in Hazelhead Academy a lot. In fact, the head teacher there, Alison Murison, now thinks that I'm a member of her staff. I think I'm there so often working with the pupils there. In terms of going forward, in terms of party policy, I think youth issues are going to feature a lot, particularly in relation to the economy. As all of you, you're going to want to get your education, or you're going to want to go into a job, and you want to make sure there's opportunities there for you to get the skills, to get the training, and at the end of the day, earn a wage. We as a party have pledged that we want an additional 10,000 modern apprenticeships to give young people the skills that you need to go into the workplace. We want to see better work between our colleges, schools and employers. We think it's really important to bring down the barriers between the two, particularly when we have the Wood report which has come out saying that actually we should have people who are able to start getting vocational training while still at school. And we think that that's actually really important, that's something that we will be bringing forward if we get enough MPs elected to Westminster. I think, so to sum up, I've got a track record of working with young people in my community, for being an advocate for young people's issues, and I'll continue to do that if you elect me as your MP in Aberdeen South. And in terms of party policy, if you want to get on and get the opportunities to succeed in life, whether that's in your education or whether in the workplace, then vote Conservative, because we are on your side.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to pass it now to Dan Yates.
Hello. I don't actually know these mics are on, do I?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'll just project anyway. Yeah. How important are youth issues to me? Very important. I still try and think of myself as a young man. I'm clinging on to 32. But as a party, the Scottish Green Party is a young party. We've gone through massive growth in the past year, since the last 6 months even, since the referendum. And almost 50% of our membership now in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire is people that are in full-time education or at university. So student issues and young people's issues are at the core of what green thinking is all about. I've jotted down 3 key things. Obviously there's lots of things that are important to youth, but the key things here I've got are continued education throughout life, job opportunities and the unemployment issue in the area, and affordable housing. I won't speak too much about job opportunities at the minute, because I think that comes into the second question about development of the city in renewables and oil and gas. But I'll certainly speak about affordable housing and the economy in general. In Aberdeen, we've been lucky to have the oil and gas industry in a sense that it's provided job security and it's provided job opportunities. But a lot of the growth in Aberdeen and the growth in the UK is measured purely in economic value. I saw this morning a tweet that came into my phone saying that the UK economy has grown by 0.3% GDP in the first quarter. Now, growth is not a terrible measure of how a country is performing, but it isn't the only measure. You know, looking at an economic growth purely by GDP just cuts out the whole social capital part of it. And if we want job security and economic security in the future, we need to emphasise that it's not just about growing capital, it's especially not about growing capital, especially when you can't have exponential growth in a world that has finite resources. It's about emphasising the human and social aspect. And the way you do that is by making communities responsible for themselves, by devolving as many powers as you can away from Westminster, perhaps Holyrood, but then it goes further. Sorry?
10 seconds.
10 seconds, okay. I didn't realise the time limit, sorry. So I'll come on to affordable housing in that case. I'll come back to that point later on perhaps today. But we need an affordable rent and housing system in the country as well for young people to get on the housing market. It's fine if they want to aspire to buy, but we need a proper regulated market that can be providing affordable social housing at rental prices with energy efficient aspects. But we'll come back to that in due course, hopefully.
Okay, I'd like to pass now on to Braden Davey.
I thought it was great that Ross had managed to find one young person that was voting for him. And
more than one willing to endorse me.
And put them on a leaflet, because it kind of just shows, I think Scottish Labour and the Labour Party put a real value on young people. I mean, we have Barry Black in West Aberdeenshire, who's our Labour candidate, and he's 20, and we'll have myself, who's the Labour candidate in Gordon, and I'm 23. So both young people, and obviously young people aren't a homogenous group. We can see within the Youth Council itself, we all have different views. And I think the value that the Labour Party put on young people is clean to be seen, that we put young people up for election, and credit to the Liberal Democrats in having a young candidate in Aberdeen North as well. And we need to focus really on young people. We have 1 in 6 under 25s are left unemployed. We were always told that the next generation can be expected to be better off than the one that went before it, but that's went into reverse. We have young people struggling to find graduate jobs. We have young people struggling to afford homes to live in, and I've lived all of these different aspects myself. So Labour's manifesto is really, I think, the manifesto which addresses young people's issues most. So regulating rents, building more affordable homes, passing a banker's bonus tax to guarantee unemployed young people a job, a training or apprenticeship, making sure that we reverse cuts to educational bursaries and making sure that we increase investment in educational places. And we've also been very clear on addressing generational inequality, making sure that we reduce pension tax relief for the richest pensioners and using that money to invest in education. But obviously, young people have varying different issues and opinions, and that's why I think it's important for anyone who's standing for election to go to youth groups such as the City Youth Council, such as the Scottish Youth Parliament, and where young people are, to make sure that you can hear them. But I think on jobs, housing and training and education, I think the Labour Party's manifesto points are very clear on those.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to now pass on to Ewan Davidson.
Young people's issues are massively important for me. I'm only 20 years old myself. I'm one of the youngest candidates in Scotland. The reason I'm standing is I want to see more young people involved in politics and empowered to take part in the political process. A lot of the voluntary work I've done has been around empowering young people and take part in things like peer education, mainly through the Youth Council itself actually. I'd like to highlight sort of 3 key issues that I see as being the major issues for young people in this election. Actually, most of them are devolved, but I think education, housing and low pay are the biggest issues facing young people right now. Looking at education, we've said we'll protect education funding and see real terms increase, which, although it's a devolved issue, will mean that Barnett Corner sequential, so funding will come to the Scottish Government, which hopefully they will continue to invest in education. We stood up against college cuts that the Scottish Government has implemented. We've also stood up against cuts to the bursaries that the Scottish Government has implemented. Secondly, the housing issue. We said we want to build 300,000 social houses across the UK in the next 5 years. That's a fully costed plan. The housing crisis is quite obvious, especially here in Aberdeen, where most young people can't afford to rent, never mind buy their own homes. We've said that we'll implement 2 schemes as well to help young people with housing. We'll do a scheme called Rent to Buy. So we're aware that one of the biggest issues facing young people in terms of housing is that they can't afford a deposit to buy their own home. We'll, as a government, lend money to those young people so that they can get onto the housing ladder and take advantage of home ownership. We'd also like to support
5 seconds.
and leave housing then. The third issue is low pay. I'd like to see the Scottish Government support the living wage through procurement contracts. We're really happy that they've introduced it in the public sector, but we'd like to see that expanded so that we see the living wage in more areas of the economy as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Now let's go on to Callum McKay.
Good evening. I'm actually finding it difficult to find a single thing that anyone has said that I would disagree with, which is quite unusual for me in these circumstances. I don't know, I think, Dan, I think you might be stretching the envelope in terms of being young. I think we need to accept that when we get to 30, we stop being young necessarily. Braden mentioned that the Labour Party are a party of young people, and I think it's great. I've been doing these kind of things for about 8 years now, and I've been used to being by far the youngest person in the room. I've been going to various functions and such like all across this city, where I have been by far the youngest person in the room, and it's actually a genuine pleasure to not be the youngest person on this panel. I'm not even close to being the youngest person on this panel. When I was first elected in 2007, there was 4 of us who were under 25, and we got merry hell for it. We were the kids that were running the council and were roundly derided by all sorts, including, I have to say, the Labour Party, who were not too happy about it. I think those times have changed, and I'm not going to suggest that's because of me and my colleagues being there. I'm not quite that arrogant. But I think there are young people across the board who are involved in politics, and that is fundamentally important. You need a better representation. I think in Scotland we struggle with women's representation, and we're getting better at that. I think we're getting better with youth representation, but you want a degree of representation from your representatives, and you want a degree of folk from different backgrounds, different ages, different genders, different ethnic backgrounds. I think we've got a long way to go to that. I think what we've touched upon in terms of what the issues are, I think housing, education, and the economy, job opportunities, are clearly the issues. I think there's unanimity on that, but those are probably the key things facing young people. But to be honest, there are issues that face all people.
10 seconds.
I've rambled on too long to talk about what we're doing, but a lot of the things we would do would be similar to what's being suggested. It's just a case of where we would like to see a lot of that done, and the pace, and the big thing, I think, is in terms of public spending, and I'm sure we'll get onto that later.
Okay, thank you very much. Now lastly, let's go on to David Lansdale.
I'm the oldest man on the panel here, and I'm probably the oldest man in the room at 62. I'm the father of 5 and the grandfather of 4, so obviously youth issues to me are vitally important, because no country can move ahead without an educated youth and without possibilities for them. Now, my story is that when I left school in 1969, there was jobs aplenty. I'm a mechanical engineer. I got an excellent education in a state school, and I got an excellent education, a technical education in the mining industry. And then moved on up here at Aberdeen in 1976. But that aside, we have to make provision for young people to get a decent education. And one of the things that has worried me the whole time that my children have been at school, and 3 of them have gone through this university, and 2 more to come, is that they keep changing the goalposts in the schools. We need to have a curriculum that educates people with the values and the subjects that they need in life. Now, I heard one of these young men here talk about apprenticeships and talk about vocational training in school. When I went to school, I was taught all the academic subjects, but I was also taught practical subjects. I changed the clutch in the first car I ever saw as a 12-year-old in mechanical engineering, metalworking. We had woodwork classes, we had technical drawing. When I left school, I was employable. Now, I own a business here in Aberdeen for the last 27 years. It's an engineering service company, and I've employed a lot of people. And what I see is that a lot of kids leave school today and believe that there are no opportunities. And there are no opportunities because the governments that we've had in the past, whether they be Conservative, Labour or whatever, haven't provided the opportunities. Now, I came into politics basically because I believe it's time now, at my time in life, to give something back, because this country gave me a whole bunch of opportunities.
10 seconds.
And what I want to do is I want to promote young people and I want to promote opportunity. That's why I have come into this.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we're going to go and do some comments on each other's answers. So first I'd like to come to Brilliant Davy, being a candidate, and comment on what they said. You have 1 minute.
I think the main thing I'd like to pick up on is Ross's comment at the start when he mentioned that the current government was doing a lot for young people. The coalition government, the Tories and Liberals, over the last 5 years have presided over a record growth in poverty for young people. 1 in 6 young people are unemployed. We have 1 in 6 young people who rely on benefits have been sanctioned by the job centre. We've seen the number of young people living in the private rented sector in poverty increase by 20%. And I think we've seen a real failure from this government to really address. They've seen lots of perks and they've been keen to protect spending on pensioner bus passes and other issues, but they haven't been keen to address young people. We even saw the Tories proposing cutting all benefits entirely for the under 25s. So I've worked full time since I'm 19. So I think really the only way you can make sure that you don't have this lurch to the right with the Tories again is a UK Labour government which will really address these key issues, as I said before at the start, with a banker's bonus tax to provide a guaranteed job, training or apprenticeship, and other investments such as the reduction in tax relief on rich pensioners and a mansion tax, all to fund money directly into young people and young people's skills and opportunities.
Okay, thank you very much. And Ross, do you have 1 minute to respond?
Yeah, to respond to that, it's amazing how much rubbish can be spoken in a minute, honestly. In terms of what we have done as a Conservative government is actually providing opportunities by over 2 million apprenticeships. We want to extend that even further. Everyone here recognises, and it's not too outgoing, everyone here recognises that if you want to get investment in education, investment in housing, investment in health, investment in the services that you care about as a young person, the only way we can do that if we have a stable economy and we can take in the taxation which pays for it. If you want to have an employer who will take you on, is to get the economy on track, because they're only going to do it if things are going well. If we saw many people lose their jobs during Labour's Great Recession, we saw young people unemployed under Labour's Great Recession because businesses weren't taking on anymore. Now we can actually turn that around, we have been turning that around, and it is our plan as a Conservative government to actually eradicate long-term youth unemployment. It's already at its lowest levels, but we want to ensure that we have then full employment for our young people. And we will do that by getting the economy on track, by improving and expanding on apprenticeships. And that is the best way for young people who want to get on and succeed to either get educated or to earn to do that.
Okay, thank you. Next, let's come to Callum McKay's comments on something that's been said.
First of all, it was quite nice. I've done quite a number of these hustings, and that's the first time I've heard the Labour and the Tories disagree with each other on things.
I disagree a lot.
It's been great. I think I would agree with a fair amount of what Braden said about the economic record. Yes, there's an increase in employment, but a lot of it is just above the breadline employment. We do not have a growth in terms of proper job opportunities. There are a plethora of zero-hour contract jobs on minimum wage, but that's not really going to cut the mustard in the long term. In terms of the minimum wage, and that I would say that is a policy that I think has been very successful, is the lifting of the income tax threshold, but I think we need to do more. And in terms of the minimum wage, when you have to have something above the minimum wage called the living wage because you can't live on the minimum wage, it suggests that there's something wrong with the minimum wage, and we absolutely must increase the living wage, the minimum wage to a level that allows people to actually get on in life.
Okay, thank you. Next, David, would you like to comment on something that's been said so far?
Well, to me, it sounded like I was sitting here listening to my 2 sons lecturing me on what's wrong with the country. I can't disagree with what most of them have said, but one of the things that you have to get into your head is it's not the function of the government to create wealth. It's the function of the government to create an environment of opportunity where entrepreneurs and small businesses create wealth. And, you know, we keep hearing about we're going to tax everybody. Let me tell you this. This government or any government can't give anybody a single penny without taking it from somebody else. And we hear about mansion taxes, we hear about bankers' bonuses. What we need to be doing is encouraging entrepreneurs and encouraging people to create businesses. Yes, we need to deal with the bankers. They should have been dealt with under the laws that already existed. But just because a person lives in a house that has a certain value, it doesn't mean that you need to strip him of all his assets simply to hand it out. What we need to do is we need to turn the country around. I hear people talking about lurching to the left, lurching to the right. You know, they refer to Red Ed and, you know, that UKIP is a right-wing party. I'm not a right-winger. I'm just an ordinary person. But what I'm trying to tell you is that we need to work together. For me, before I check out, you know, for what time I have left, I would like to actually see, once upon a time, a government of national unity to address all of the problems. Instead of, you know, the Labour manifesto says this, Tory manifesto says that. We need to work together.
Okay, next let's come to Ewan Davison to comment on something that's been said.
I'd like to take up what David said. Talked a lot about opportunities for young people and businesses investing in this country. I'd like to know how pulling us out of the European Union is going to encourage investment in this country, encourage opportunities. Because there's 6 million jobs in this country dependent on the European Union. And your economic policies would destroy opportunities for young people. So I'm not sure where these opportunities in this business investment is going to come from.
Okay, David, got a minute to answer.
Well, we continually hear that there are 3 million jobs at risk or 6 million jobs at risk. There are actually about 2.5 million jobs that are associated with trade with the European Union. Now, we don't need to be in a political union in order to trade with Europe, our friends in Europe. We don't need to have that. We have a Commonwealth that we traded with. We can still trade with Europe without being shackled to it politically. We can. It's businesses that do business with each other. Countries don't trade with each other.
But you need to apply to the European
Can
regulations.
David finish his 1 minute commenting back,
Sorry.
please?
Well, I've lived a fair amount of time in this world, and I know that I do business with countries all over the world, including Europe. You don't need to be in a political union where your laws are dictated from an unelected body.
You sound like the SNP. Together.
Well,
Oh, no, they do not.
Well, what,
You have 10 seconds left.
what I would like to hear tonight is I want somebody to tell me what UKIP is about. That's what I would like to hear. What are the final things tonight? You tell me.
You're the UKIP candidate.
Self-determination is a right of every individual on this planet and every country. Self-determination. We do not need to be in a political union in order to do business with people and be friends with people.
If
David?
said political union requires you to meet their stipulations in order to trade with them, then you do need to be in a political union with them. You could be
Kelly
in the
has another
Norwegian.
opportunity to comment back, David. Next, let's come to Dan Needs.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment on the job of government to provide opportunities. It's maybe not the job of government, but the markets aren't self-regulating, and therefore it is the job of government to put in legislation to keep those markets in check. Especially when it comes to areas of housing, we talked about social housing being built. It's more than just building more houses, especially in a city like Aberdeen, where fuel poverty and housing poverty are rife, and the wage inequality is so massive that people have bought their houses perhaps through right to buy, perhaps through some other mechanism, and the rocketing house price means that people can't afford to rent, and they then aspire to buy because they see that as the best investment for their money. It's a self-perpetuating system. So it is a job of the government to put in caps on that. And I think in this country, we don't look to the rest of Europe in terms of example that's been led. I'm part of Commonweal in Aberdeen, and the job of Commonweal in part is to look elsewhere in Europe and the world, a wider world, and see what are countries doing differently that we can implement here. And if you look at countries like Holland and Germany, in Germany, 50% of the population rent, and they're quite happy to rent. It's on long-term leases. It's in houses they'd be happy to own, but they don't feel the need to own them because they can rent them very well. In Holland, they have caps, and they have a system where you can't pay more rent than it's worth. They have a rated system where if you pay amount of rent based on its energy efficiency, amongst other things, and if it's not up to standard, you can take that landlord to court in a paid system, and your fees are paid for you. There's no cost. And if it's not the rent that's due, you can get that money back. So we need to be looking at the way that government can legislate and keep the house pricing and rental market down, as well as building affordable housing at the same time.
Okay, and finally it's come to Ross to comment on anything that's been said so far.
Again, I thought it's Callum had an opportunity, or
I think we all have.
Yeah.
I've several, so sorry.
Okay. Just on what we've heard from the others, again, I think it's quite clear that the only way we're going to get opportunity, and we've seen increased opportunity is to get the economy going. I know it sounds like a broken record, but it's fact. You know, that's how we do it. I want to see more investment in vocational education. I think the Wood report, which I touched on, to expand that a wee bit more, said we actually do need to break down those barriers, and there's an opportunity for us to allow people to start studying those vocational qualifications while at school. And I think that's really important, particularly in Aberdeen, where we've actually got a skills gap, and a real skills gap that we need to fill. Particularly in oil and gas as well, they're experiencing that about over the next 10 years. I think the skills gap about 125,000. But here in council as well, Aberdeen City Council struggles to recruit people to do basic things as well, whether that's maintenance in the housing stock that we've got, whether it's roads engineers, the rest of it. So it's really important. These are things which affect people's quality of life, and we need people to do the jobs, and getting investment in vocation is extremely important. And that's why we want to see further investment in our colleges. There's been a huge amount of cuts to our colleges, but we want to see that turned around, because we know that they play a really key role in giving people the skills to get on in life.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. We're going to go on to our second pre-submitted question of the evening. So, if you are elected, how do you aid the development of the city, especially in regard to the oil crisis? And this time I'd like to come to Callum McCaig first, please.
Okay. Aid the development of the city. I'll take the first part of that first in terms of the oil crisis. I think we are in a position where we are an awful lot more resilient as a city than we would have been at any of the previous times when the oil price has collapsed, as it has in recent months. The change in this city in terms of being a global energy hub, and a genuine global energy hub, has insulated the city to a fair degree. It's clearly a difficult time, and there are job losses happening, and there needs to be specific targeted support in order to provide initially support for those who've been made redundant, but also long-term support for the oil and gas industry, both in terms of diversifying into new markets, and potentially and hopefully advanced support for renewable energy. But I think we need to recognise that there's still a lot of opportunity in the North Sea if given the right support. We are proposing that there should be extended support in terms of exploration for the oil industry to help them get back to looking for more oil and gas in the North Sea. There's a fair chunk that has been untapped, and we're not going to find it unless we go looking for it. In terms of aiding the development of the city, I mean, a lot of that is largely for the City Council and or the Scottish Government. The support, the UK Government holds the purse strings, so I guess that's key. But also I think about development in terms of what the UK Government will do is around about things like welfare, things like the minimum wage and such like. I think they are the fundamentals for Scotland and for Aberdeen in this election, given the devolved settlement. So in terms of boosting the minimum wage, in terms of stopping some of the pretty gratuitous attacks on poor folk that we've seen through welfare reform, I think that would aid the development of this city. I think it would aid the development of the individuals who are struggling in this city. This is a great city if you've got the cash to live here. If you don't, there's an additional burden here due to the cost of living, in particular the cost of accommodation. The authorities, the powers that be that have responsibility over housing, namely the Scottish Government and the City Council, need to be equipped with the tools, and those tools are pounds and pence essentially. If we cut the budget, which is being suggested, we're not going to see that development. We're going to see more hardship.
Okay, next let's come to Raymond Davey, please.
I think, as was mentioned before, it's all about what happens on a UK-wide scale as well as what happens locally. And I think one of the huge issues is making sure that there's a stable fiscal regime, so there's a stable regime so businesses know how to invest. So I think what concerns me, and I think it also concerns businesses, is the proposed referendum on the European Union. Huge instability with that both UKIP and the Conservatives want. I think there's another issue with the SNP's plans for attempts at a second referendum, or even without a second referendum, full fiscal autonomy for Scotland. So all the money raised in Scotland is generated in Scotland. So for the oil and gas industry, that would mean it's the backbone for the Scottish budget, it's the backbone for pensions that are paid in Scotland. So I think there needs to be some continuity. From a Labour standpoint, we wouldn't have another referendum on independence, and we wouldn't have a referendum on the European Union. We think it's time to make sure that we get back to governing, to the real issues of health and education. I think specifically for Aberdeen, it is a question of the UK block grant to Scotland and how it's allocated. So the Conservatives plan to cut that. But I think there's also an issue within Scotland how the budget is allocated. So Aberdeen City Council can't raise much of the money it generates. So we all know that most of the money that Aberdeen raises is sent to Holyrood to be spent mainly on the central belt. So Aberdeen's one of the poorest funded council areas. We also see that Aberdeen's not able to raise its own tax through the council tax, which the Scottish Government's dictated be frozen. So I think there needs to be a lot more power for local authorities, so through the city deal, which I think is a good thing, to be able to allocate their own affairs. There's no point devolving power if it's just kept at Edinburgh. We need power in Aberdeen to run our own affairs, just as Scotland needs more power to through the Smith Commission. So I think those are a few issues. But specifically on the oil fund as well, Scottish Labour propose a stability fund. So that will be a pot of money, so when oil prices collapse, there's a pot of money available to ease the transition from high oil price to a low oil price.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, let's come to Dan Yates.
Yeah, the Scottish Green Party believes that there should be a transition away from away from oil and gas technology and fossil fuel burning to a renewable industry, not only to further the efforts of climate change, security, also to ensure there's job security, energy security in the North East and in the wider region. But at the same time, as a candidate in Aberdeen South, I recognise that the oil industry and its existence is important to the job security of the region. And so it's not about moving away in one fell swoop and replacing one industry with another. It's about parallel investment and putting in legislative measures that hold oil and gas companies to account. I think that the industry has a role to play in the transition to renewable energy, but it has to come with caveats. So it's going to get tax breaks, so it's going to get incentives to go and explore further. That has to come with social capital gains as well. So it has to invest more in our development of the renewable sector to begin with, but more in terms of community development, in terms of social spaces. We've seen Aberdeen hasn't had the kind of investment that it should have had based on the kind of money that's coming through the city. If you look at Union Street and the empty shops and the areas of the city that are pretty deprived, it's not everyone that's benefited from oil and gas. And it's not perhaps the industry's job to pay for that purely by themselves, but it certainly has to have more of a role to play. And it's the legislative measures that you can put in place as a government to hold them to account. If you want to come and explore here and invest and make money here, fine, but you need to invest more heavily in the social side of the city. The city region deal coming up is a fantastic opportunity to development. It will develop hopefully greater transport links in the region. We need to see greater use of rail. We want to bring the railways back into public hands so we can open local stations. And all that will develop the city region into a much more beneficial place. But it's all about having legislative regimes in place, first of all, to make commitments towards targets and towards real renewable change and holding the oil industry to account.
5 seconds.
I'll finish there for now.
Okay. Next, let's go to David Lansdale.
Well, life after oil and gas. Well, I've worked in the energy sector since 1969, from coal mining through to where I am now. And obviously in that time, I've had the opportunity to work all over the world in the oil industry. And you go to these places, we hear the same thing in the Gulf of Mexico, that the local communities don't really benefit that much from the oil and gas industry there because it simply only comes from wages. I've lived here long enough now to realise and to see that, he's absolutely right, that the oil industry here has generated billions upon billions of pounds, but you would never guess it when you walk down Union Street. A friend of mine was here from Houston a few weeks ago, and he thought the place had shut down when he walked down Union Street. Where's all the money gone? Well, obviously, all the governments have taken the money, and it's been used for other things. And I fully agree that the oil companies should be brought to book and should be made to invest in the areas that they're working in. There's plenty of life left in the North Sea, and we hear, tax cuts for the majors to go and explore for it. But the thing of it is, we need to pump the money back into the community. We need houses. We need green spaces. I agree with the man from the Green Party. We only have one planet to live on, and if we destroy it, then there won't be anywhere else. So if I'm elected as an interested party in the oil and gas industry, I will lobby to make sure that money comes back from these oil companies and comes back to the city to benefit the people here.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, let's go to Ross Thompson.
Yeah, in terms of the oil price itself, it's out with the control of any one government itself. It's dictated by international factors. It's Saudi Arabia keeping producing, shale in America. However, it obviously has impacted us here in Aberdeen, in the wider North East. And I'm really pleased that the government took cognizance of that and actually gave the industry a 1.3 billion boost in the last budget. What that entailed was cutting supplementary charge from 30% to 20%. That shows that the North Sea is open for business to get that investment. Petroleum revenue tax reduced from 50% to 35% to ensure that we can actually get the oil out from some of the most hardest to reach places and some of those more developed sites where it is more difficult to get the oil out. That helps with that incentive. Then we've got 20 million, which is going to go into seismic surveys to help with further exploration, because that's the challenge now. It's not just getting oil out where we know where it is, it's trying to find the new wells, it's trying to find the new deposits of oil that we need to get out. That exploration has to happen now if we're to continue. And I'm really pleased that the government gave us that support. And now we have one of the most competitive tax regimes that there is. And I think that is great for Aberdeen, and it's great for you in terms of opportunities that you want to seek within the oil and gas industry. If we see more investment and see further exploration, that is good for jobs. Part of it is also City Deal. It's been touched on already. We've opened up negotiations in City Deal. We worked really hard as a council to bring together a bid. I myself was liaising with others within my own party to make sure we could get the connections there, and that worked. Now, what we need to do is make sure we get the investment. That's $3 billion, which can go into roads infrastructure, that'll go into housing, that'll go into broadband connectivity to help anchor the industries here so they don't take flight at the end of the day. We get the infrastructure here to ensure further investment in our local economy. Now, don't put that at risk by seeing a change of government now. I say that we're on the right track with the economy. We're at the early stage of these negotiations. Let's continue it through, and if you'll let me, as your MP, I could be an MP at the heart of what could be a Conservative government, and what better way to deliver for local residents here than to have an MP who can do that for you.
Okay, thank you very much. And next let's come to Ewan Davidson.
I would agree with Ross that the first step to development has to be a stable economy. And we started to work on that in this government. We're seeing growth returning, we're seeing inflation dropping, and we're seeing more investment confidence. But that recovery is at risk. We've got the Tories being dragged to the right by UKIP, who have said there will be no tax rises as part of reducing the deficit. That's massive cuts to our social services, which does not help the development of the city. And we've got Labour who are being dragged to the left by the Green Party and the SNP, promising more borrowing. Again, that discourages investment, that discourages the development of the city. And I would say that the threat of a European referendum promised by the Tories and UKIP, as Braden said, is a massive threat to the development of the city. What we've done, government, the city deal, I think, is a massive opportunity. The City Council, working with the Scottish Government and the UK Government, so most of the parties in this panel, offers a great opportunity for investment in the city, more powers for the City Council, and crucially for me, it's investing in other areas apart from oil and gas. So we diversify the city economy so that we're investing in jobs that aren't dependent on one industry. Additionally, I think the city deal is great in that it devolves some power to the City Council, but I don't think we're doing enough. We've seen quite a few powers stripped away from the City Council by the Scottish Government over the last few years. I think we should devolve more power to our local area, because we know that Aberdeen has specific economic challenges. I think we in the city are best placed to deal with those economic challenges, because we know the problems when the oil price drops. We've seen the effect in this city. If we've got more economic powers, if we've got more powers in our local area, we can tackle those challenges. Finally, turn to the oil and gas part of the question. I'm really happy that it's a Lib Dem Energy Secretary that's just announced a massive tax cut for the oil and gas industry.
Conservative chance.
It was a Lib Dem Energy Secretary that commissioned the Wood Report, which has set the Oil and Gas Authority, which I think offered just a great opportunity for some stability within the industry.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, first to comment on each other's answers, I'd like to go to Dan Yates, please.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up some more of the spending examples that Ewan gave just now. I don't think it's strictly about more borrowing or more severe cuts. It's about rebalancing spending in general. So looking at the areas we spend money in at the moment, such as the arms industry and the defence spending budgets, and coming into line more with other European countries that are progressive and socialist, and we spend about 2.67% of our GDP on defence at the minute. We need to reduce that drastically, and one of the key measures we can do that with is by getting rid of Trident. It's a not deterrent to anything, it doesn't serve any point, let's get rid of it. And let's start spending more of that money in social development, innovation and investment in research and development in areas that are going to benefit us in the long run, such as renewables. In terms of cuts, it shouldn't be cuts on the back of the people that can't afford to make those cuts. We have, 1% of the population earning, more than £1 million a year. I don't always agree with progressive taxes and that it should be
10 seconds.
people that are paying the majority, but the way you increase the tax base is to start enabling the people at the bottom end by giving them a decent wage. We want to put in a minimum wage of £10 an hour by 2020 so that everyone can be in a position to pay tax in the first place and feel like they contribute to society.
Okay, thank you. You would like to respond to that?
It's interesting that you're talking about that you don't particularly always support high taxes. One of your party's pledges is a 65% tax on top earners. That's a lot of people in the city that you'd be hit with extremely high taxes. I'm not sure where that came from. And the other thing, you talked about parallel investment earlier. Your party leader condemned when we cut the taxes in the oil industry and invested more in the industry and said that that was that we should stop subsidising the industry at all. So I'm not sure. It's great that you think that, but the party's manifesto says something totally different.
Can I respond?
Yeah, we've got 50 seconds to respond.
I'm not aware of a 65% tax increase on top earners. I know there's a 2% tax on very, very top earners. That's in the top 1%. Like I say, they're earning millions of pounds a year. But that's on people that are totally off the scale in terms of the average Joe who's earning, a decent wage in Aberdeen. These are people that have grabbed the mass growth. I talked about growth earlier on in GDP, 0.3% of that in the first quarter. If there is growth in the country, it's been concentrated massively at the top 1%, top 10% at the very most. It's not being grown and experienced by the bottom percentage. So I wouldn't normally support progressive taxes, but in the case when the wealth gap is so huge, then we need to start somewhere. But we need to do it in development with empowering people at the bottom as well.
10 seconds.
Okay, that's all there for now.
Okay, I'd like to go on to David Lansdale next, please.
Well, again, before you can tax anybody, they have to earn something.
Exactly.
And the country, we have to be able to produce and export to bring money in. Simply taxing people because they happen to be wealthy or they happen to earn a lot of money isn't going to solve the problem. Because you tax these people to the point where they pick up their tent and leave. We need to, as everybody has said here, we need to balance this economy in this country, and we need to get back to basics. This is a manufacturing, exporting country. We need to rebuild our manufacturing base. And we also need to, as he said, make work pay. Nobody wants to live on benefits. Nobody wants to be permanently in a situation where they're dependent on a handout from the state. I don't want to see that, and I don't believe anybody else wants to see that either. So whoever is elected as the next government in this election needs to work, first of all, on stabilizing the economy and getting the country back to work. It would be nice to give everybody in the country a handout one way or another.
10 seconds.
But we need to encourage self-determination.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to go to Callum Craig next.
I would agree to a certain extent with the sense that you need to earn money before you can tax it. But before you can earn it, you need to educate people so that they can earn it. You need to have roads on which they can export or deliver to their markets whatever it is that they've made, and various other things that you need government to provide. So it's not a chicken and egg. The things come as one. We have a society, we have people who make money, and we tax them accordingly, and it's a degree of balance. You mentioned that we're an exporting manufacturing nation. I detect a hint of irony that your party wishes us to withdraw from a single market of 350 million people, the biggest single market of its kind in the world. If you're a manufacturing nation, I would have thought you would want unhindered access to sell your goods. The reality, though, is that we're not really a manufacturing nation. I think we do need to get back to that. I think that would help to a degree.
You've got 10 seconds.
I think too many of our eggs have been put in one basket in terms of financial services, and there is a requirement for diversification in our economy.
Okay, David, like to respond to that?
Well, our single biggest customer is the United States of America. The Commonwealth that we still have that we can trade with, Just because, if we were, just imagine if we were to leave the European Union, do you think for one moment that Germany and France and all these other countries wouldn't want to deal with us, or wouldn't want to do business with us? Of course they would. Of course they would want to do business with them. The whole point about leaving the EU as far as UKIP is concerned, as far as I'm concerned, is that this country has the capability, has the intelligence to be able to run its own affairs, deal with its own laws, and run its own parliament. I mean,
You have 10 seconds.
I'll close there.
Okay, let's go to Braden Davey next, please.
We've just heard that UKIP want to be in the United Kingdom but outside the European Union, and the SNP want to be outside the United Kingdom but within the European Union. So why not be in both and get the best of both worlds for the UK and the European Union? But I'll pick up a few points before. And Ross said they've cut taxes. They wouldn't have had to cut taxes if they put them up in the first place on the oil industry. And he talked about being a Tory MP in a Tory government. I can't imagine of anything worse for the people in Aberdeen than electing a Tory MP. With their 12 billion of welfare cuts, which they haven't said where it's coming from, so that's on the backs of the disabled, on the poor, on the vulnerable. And Ewan talked about the deficit, getting the deficit down. But the Tory Liberal coalition have borrowed more in 5 years than every single Labour government in history put together. And another one is, he talked about Labour's being dragged to the left. I think it's actually the SNP that have finally been dragged to the left by putting Labour policies in the manifesto. The SNP spent the referendum campaign arguing for tax cuts on big businesses. The SNP have froze council tax. These are all Tory policies, so I'm glad that the SNP have finally come around and adopted a progressive manifesto.
Okay, last next comes to Ross Thompson.
Yeah, okay, just to briefly touch on what Braden said there. That's interesting because 2011, yes, taxes went up, and it's interesting because at that point, yeah, profits were going up for all those businesses, and actually it was more expensive at the pump for us. So interesting coming from someone who's Labour, who doesn't think we should have put on those taxes to make sure that there's relief for the hard-working families who are paying more at the pump. What you've now had is a government which has responded to that, and now we have the most competitive tax regime that there is. I think that's good. It's the first time there's ever actually been in what people can remember who work in this industry, a tax cut for the industry. To touch on then what Ewan was saying, which was quite interesting, that we're being dragged to the right by the 2 MEPs that UKIP have, and the 2 MEPs are probably only going to get. So no, we're not going to be dragged to the right by them. So let's cut through the spin and get to the facts. When you spoke about taxation, the top 1% pay 25%. Taxes are going up, so actually we'll be paying 27%. The people's taxes that we've cut have actually been those who have been the most hardest working in this country, and we're actually going to extend those tax cuts, so actually 30 million people will be paying less tax and even more taken out of tax altogether. So that is our policy. We're taking it further, and you are not. So if you want stability and you want more money in your pocket, then vote Conservative, and don't listen to the Liberal Democrats who will take credit for the good things but run away from their record in government as soon as it doesn't appeal.
Yeah, you have 30 seconds to respond to that.
On the tax point, in 2010, Dave Cameron stood up and said that the income tax cut was unaffordable. He said that to every single...
Let you finish his answer.
That's what we were saying. You said it was unaffordable. You wouldn't have done it
So
if
why
we
have you
weren't
not
in
got
power.
extended in your
Well,
manifesto?
let you finish his
It's on
30
the front
second answer.
page.
Okay, 30 seconds for anyone else?
You wouldn't think they've been in coalition for the past 5 years, voting with each other on every policy that came up. And the Liberal Democrats could have voted against any Tory policy they wanted. The Liberal Democrats could have stopped the bedroom tax. The Liberal Democrats could have stopped the Tory government. Instead, they chose to prop it up for the last 5 years.
That's because we're proud of our record, Braden, and that involves cleaning up the mess that you left as well, so we're very proud of that.
Okay, and with that, I think we'll conclude our first half of the hustings. And we're going to have a 10-minute break, so please come back at 7:30. So I'd first like to ask for some general questions that can be put to all the candidates. Scott?
I would like to bring up the point of the economy. I probably won't need this actually. I quite like how Labour at the moment are saying that.
Scott, just general questions first, please.
Oh, sorry. I'd like to ask Labour what they would do differently this time in.
No, it's a general question for all the candidates first, and specific questions will be later on. Just ask the question.
Okay, so I'd like more specifically what the candidates are thinking about what they could do for the economy since the Conservatives and Lib Dems have been in power, and which party could be benefit and could be done better this time.
Okay, first I would like to come to you, Davidson.
I think in terms of the economy, we've seen since in 2010 when we took over in office, unemployment was rising, inflation was rising, inequality was actually rising. Under this government, we're now seeing a return to growth, the strongest growth in the G8, the strongest growth in Europe. We're seeing debt as a share of the economy falling, and we're seeing inequality falling, actually. And we've actually got inflation at nearly 0%, which helps ordinary hard-working people. I think there's two threats to that economic growth. We could veer off to the left and see uncontrolled debt and uncontrolled spending, or we can veer off to the right and we've got the threat of a European referendum, which would destroy confidence in the economy. It's already happening.
15 seconds.
I would like to take up something that Braden had said earlier, that debt grew under this government. Yes, debt has grown, but we've reduced the deficit. That's what we said, we've reduced the deficit. That's the rate that the debt is growing. The rate that the debt was growing was rising every day under the last Labour government. We've reduced that. So debt's still growing, but we're getting on the track to actually reducing the debt itself.
Okay, next let's come to Bryn Davey, please.
He says they've cut the deficit. Under the original proposals, the Liberals and Tories told us they'd get rid of the deficit and we'll be in surplus by now. And the last time we were borrowing £81 billion. It's quite clear that the Liberals and Tories have failed. We need a change. They've cut taxes for millionaires, while all of us pay more. The minimum wage has increased by a measly 20 pence last time. We've seen the number of young people on 0-hour contracts going through the roof. We've seen the number of people relying on food banks to feed their own families, despite working full-time, go through the roof. We need a change. We need a change in direction. The only way we can do that is with a Labour government that will put the minimum wage up, that will cut taxes for ordinary folk, and also make sure that we invest in our NHS. We've seen that the Tories propose record spending cuts, a roller coaster of spending cuts, and Labour don't support that. Labour support measured increases in taxes such as the mansion tax, the 50p tax rate, and we're quite open about this. It's not popular to say that we support raising taxes on people, but we do. We support raising taxes on some people
10 seconds.
to pay for services that we all rely on. So we need to do things differently, and Labour would.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go to Ross Thompson next, please.
Yeah, in terms of the economy, nothing I would do differently. I think what we need to do is actually continue with what we're doing, not do something differently. That is why we need to continue with getting the economy on track. Now, if you gave your keys to a friend and that friend crashed the car and you spent all that money and all that time getting it fixed, as soon as you did, would you give them the keys back? No, you wouldn't. It's the same thing. Why on earth would you give the keys to the economy back to the people who crashed it, caused the recession, and caused the amount of job losses for also young people that was suffered as a consequence? Under this government, over 174,000 jobs have been created in Scotland alone. 1,000 jobs a day have been created since 2010. We've actually taken the ordinary folk that Brendan mentioned there, they've been taken out of tax or are paying lower tax, and we want to go further. And then we want to go even further than that by actually taking out all those who are being paid minimum wage out of tax altogether. So it's clear from what Braden has said that he simply hasn't learned the lessons of the past, and that we would get the same borrowing, the same spending, the same debt with Labour, and that would actually make us all worse off for it, because that's more in your interest rates, that's more in your taxes, and you'll be paying for it, and that's not fair.
Braden likes to respond.
He's blaming, saying I didn't learn the lessons of the last Labour government, but when the last Labour government came to power, I was only 5 years old, so I don't think you can particularly blame me from the entire last Labour government.
Can you let Braden finish, please?
Labour crashed the economy is nonsense. Labour did not crash the economy, it was a global recession. Paying teachers, paying nurses, building schools, building hospitals did not crash the economy. It's utter nonsense from the Tories.
They didn't live within their means, and that's the lesson.
Neither are you.
We are living with our... Yeah, that's what... You keep criticising us for austerity, don't you?
Let's move on. Dan, would you like to answer the question?
Yeah, I think, speaking about deficit and debt reduction, we've always lived in some sort of deficit, and I think one of the ways that the last administration, current administration, have tried to offset that deficit is by introducing quantitative easing. So it's not about borrowing from external sources, it's about borrowing internally. But the way that they spent the money was wrong. You shouldn't have made quantitative easing exist and then put the money into the banks that had such an impact in the first place. If there is going to be a repeat of any sort of quantitative easing method, it should be putting the money that's generated into the hands of social developments and community groups and local authorities where the money can be spent on the ground properly and not letting it go back into this top-down trickle-down effect, which doesn't work. It's not about the fact that I've said it already, growth doesn't exist. It's that it's a concentration of wealth in the top section, and it's not being redistributed around the economy fully enough.
Okay, thank you. Next, let's come to David Lansdale.
Well, I'm not actually sure what the young man's question was, but the thing is that we were in a hell of a mess in 2010, and the coalition government have gone a long way towards trying to fix it. Now, you can't fix in 5 years damage that was done over 13 years. The analogy about crashing cars and fixing them is, you know, pretty close too. But the thing of it is that, you know, he said, she said, blaming this and that and everything else. There's a fundamental problem with the way that the country gets run, with regardless of whose government is in business. We need to get back to the fact that you can't live beyond your means. You know, if you go out and if you earn £100 a week and you spend £150, then you get into trouble, right? So what do? You go and bang on your neighbour's door next door and say, I need your money now because I've already wasted mine. I want yours to waste. And
you have 10 seconds.
It's all about tax. The whole thing is about tax.
Okay, lastly, come to Callum McKay.
I got your question perfectly clearly. It was about what we would do differently. And I think what we as a country and probably as Western society need to do differently is tackle inequality. The most successful economies in the world, by and large, have a much smaller disparity between the wealthiest and the richest. If you look to our neighbours in Scandinavia, if you look to the powerhouse economies of Europe, they do better than we do in terms of inequality. Inequality has in this country has rocketed. It's not a good thing. If you put money into the hands of those who have least, they will spend it. If you give money to those who have lots, they will put it in their bank accounts, potentially in Switzerland or the Bahamas, and we won't see the benefits of it. So we need to do things that actually put money back into the hands of those who will spend it. That comes from things like increasing the minimum wage. I think everyone is missing the point. We're fixated about debt and deficit. Let's talk about some of the things in a different way, which will still cover that, but actually make a difference to people's lives.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's open up to the floor for another general question for all the candidates, please. Yes, the front here.
Yeah, okay. This is a bit unusual. That's fine. Do you think our supply of new money should be created by private banks or public institution? Because at the minute it's created by private banks.
Okay, let's go to Dan Hughes first, please.
I would advocate a full reserve banking system where the banks cannot create money, and certainly can't then create interest on it and bring that money back out to the economy. We would like to advocate a green investment bank, which partly ties in the breakup of RBS. We as a citizen of the country, you're a shareholder in RBS, and we would like to see that system broken down into local banks that specialise in local investment and local community ownership. A lot of the Green Party rhetoric is about localism. People on the ground are best placed to decide what's best for them. And if they can get access to funding from local administrations and furthering things like housing cooperatives, general cooperatives, sustainable development that is focused in the community, renewable assets that they own and can benefit themselves. And if that money can come from the private sector through green investment, then that's the future. But certainly banks should be able to create money only within their own scope, and it shouldn't be then taken out of the system and gambled for profit that's not being trickled down to the rest of the population.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Brendan Davey.
I think there's Iceland's trying this at the moment with having a state-run bank that creates money. I don't know whether about moving to a full reserve ratio, but I do think the reserve ratios need to increase so banks hold more of the money that they say they hold. I also think, as Dan mentioned, a Labour government would split the banks up. So the risky hedge fund aspect of it would be separate from the day-to-day lending to ordinary people, the day-to-day sort of mortgage applications, savings. Those two would be separate because at the moment they're put together. So banks' risky businesses can put on it, which you saw with Northern Rock when that went back post. I'd probably need to know more about the specific about the state creating money, but I suppose quantitative easing with the Bank of England printed a lot, and that went into the pockets of banks to sort of attempt to trickle down, and it hasn't really worked. So I would be very open to looking at other ideas to try and get into hands of ordinary people.
Okay, thank you. Next, let's go to David, please.
Well, it's fairly obvious that the bankers were out of control, casino banking. Look at the Royal Bank of Scotland. It was buying up a bank at the very last minute, which was dead on its feet to start with. And me, I'm a high-pressure plumber, so I'm not really fully au fait with banking and money. But the thing of it is that I never could get my head around the buying of debts. I didn't realise that a debt had any value other than the fact that it was owed to the bank. So the Royal Bank of Scotland went out and started buying up massive debts in Chicago, of all places. Buying up mortgages, what they called subprime mortgages, that they knew they could never recover. And of course they were out there gambling with yours and my money. Now I remember when I was young, there were lots of banks here in Scotland. And that's the way it needs to be. I agree with what this young man has said, that it needs to be returned to a system where the money is under control. And that these bankers...
Okay, 5 seconds. Okay, next let's go to you and Davidson.
Honest answer is that I don't know the answer to your question. I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert in economics, but I would agree with a lot of what Dan said actually. What we want to see is a lot more local banking and a lot. What we've tried to do in this government, not very successfully, but I think that might be something to do with coalition partners, is put up a barrier between the casino banking and the ordinary everyday banking in the state banks that we own. What I'd also like to see, which is part of the sort of localised comment Dan was talking about, is what we've done in this government is we say we'll cut taxes for any company that encourages share ownership for its employees. And I think that would be a good system for the banks as well, in that it would spread the wealth and spread the control of the economy to more people.
Okay, thank you. Next, let's come to Ross Thompson.
Yeah, in terms of the banks, one of the key challenges actually was to get them lending again, and that's something that we've worked to do since 2010, and that's been good because it's helped entrepreneurs who want to start up their own business to unlock the funds to do it in businesses as well. That's really good because that means that they can put the investment into their business so they can take on more people and provide jobs, and that they can grow their business, which gives more people opportunity. I think that's been really key. What we've also done in terms of the banks is, as you've seen, that there was a big government bailout, and we believe that when the taxpayers' money has gone into that actually you get the right to get that back, and that's why we're saying you can get shares in the government-owned sections of Lloyds. I think that's right, again, so you have a stake in that. It was your money that went into it in the first place. We've capped payday loans, which I think is incredibly important. We have going to support, in part of our manifesto, support challenger banks. So we know that, yes, we need to have more choice because there's big banks out there. So we will support the help and start with challenger banks. I think that's good in terms of looking for more personal accounts, mortgages as well. There's that array of choice. That's something that we're supporting, and I hope in some way that's helped answer your question as well.
Okay, let's come to Callum McCaig.
I doubt it because I don't think it was an answer to the question. In principle, yes, I agree. I think I think it's right that private entities can create money like that. Fractional reserve banking is probably one of the absolute cornerstones of the capitalist economy, though. So I think a transition away from that would be very difficult. But in principle, I don't know how that came about, but it's a bit of a racket, quite frankly. In terms of what I would like to see, and there is the vast majority of wealth is created by banks in terms of that, in terms of the money supply. But there is, and it has been mentioned, the Bank of England has that opportunity through quantitative easing. And I forget the numbers that were electronically printed or created or whatever, but it's enormous. And that money could have done so much more use. Had that been put to better use, as has been suggested by folk here, rather than just shoring up banks' balance sheets, we wouldn't be in anywhere near the difficulty that we are economically in this country.
Okay, thank you very much. Any lasting comments on the answers you've had?
Yeah, that was a good answer. But I just wanted to say to Ross as well, you said that you've got the banks lending again, but the vast majority of the money the banks lend is for mortgages for people, because the mortgages are a much more safe investment for the banks. So not much of the banks still don't like lending money to businesses.
Well, I know from the business community that I speak to here in Aberdeen, and there's a good number of small businessmen who are trying to grow their business, which again helps with opportunity here. And they found a remarkable difference already in trying to get those business loans. There's people who people actually sitting in this room, your ambition might not just be to earn, but actually to start up your own company. I think it's really important that you can do that. And actually we've seen that from the banks. You've got to, for my sins, worked in the bank for a period, and I could see what was happening after the crash, and actually how awful it became. It was part of the reason I left the bank, is that I didn't like the practices, I just didn't feel comfortable. I could see at first hand that they weren't lending. In fact, those who were getting the support weren't getting it. Those who actually needed the help were actually the ones being targeted in a way, because it was like, here's somebody with a credit card, here's somebody trying to pay off their debts, let's try and get them in more debt, and that was just wrong. But in terms of the bank, I've heard it from the business community directly that yeah, they're seeing that difference now, but there's still a long way to go. And that's why it's important we can get some more challengers as well in the market, so there is that breadth of choice.
The thing is, do you have to have debt to be able to grow the economy? Because 97% of all the money in the economy now is debt.
Yeah,
And if you cancelled all the debt, it would solve some problems.
Yeah, 30 seconds.
There's two sides. There's two sides to that equation. There's debt and there's an asset, because it's incredibly difficult. Could you cancel it? I don't see how you could. It would, again, if you're doing that, this is not. This is revolution. This is not evolution of public policy. This is manning the barricades type thing, and I think that's probably a bit beyond what any of us would stretch to.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to move on to another question. Does anyone have any more general questions for all the candidates? Stuart?
Hey, well, last 12 months we've seen a lot of constitutional and I suppose development of how we have our government, what government's made up of, where the power structures lie. What's each party proposing? And we hear each year some sort of offer, whether it's reforming the House of Lords, whether it's federalisation, but nothing seems to change, and there's definitely appetite for change. So what is each party promising, and how will they deliver it?
Okay, thank you. First, let's come to Callum McCaig, please.
Yes, there's been a lot of discussion on the Constitution. I think that's actually been pretty well done by and large. There's disagreement on this panel as to what our preferred constitutional method is. I think there's probably closer to a majority in favour of abolishing the House of Lords. I think that would be a starter in terms of a UK constitution. More than half of our parliamentarians have not been elected, which I think calls into question whether we're actually a democracy or not. But in terms of that, how we would deliver that is supporting the Labour Party in abolishing it. I think they've pledged to do that a number of times, but never actually got round to it. In fairness, they probably had other things that they considered more important to do. But I think I've rabbited on about House of Lords. Clearly, I'm in favour of independence. We've done that question, and it's now about making sure that there's a devolution settlement that works for Scotland, not proposing another referendum.
Okay, thank you. Let's go on to Ross Thompson, please.
In this Parliament, we propose actually we should reduce the number of MPs, so it would mean withdrawing the boundaries to reduce the 650 odd members of Parliament that there are. There we thought that was too much, and that's also too costly to you as a taxpayer, and it was the Liberal Democrats that scuppered that and quite openly did so. So that's fine. We'd started the process, but that didn't happen. I think one thing we're speaking about in this current campaign, though, is about the constitutional future of the UK, and that is now looking at devolution not just within Scotland but other parts of the UK. So we want to continue with further devolution of powers to Wales, but looking at what happens in England too. And we've come forward with a proposal for English votes for English laws. It's sort of, at the moment in Parliament, the SNP kind of do it by practice. The Liberal Democrats signed up to it in the UK government command paper and in their previous manifesto. And we're saying that in terms of English-only issues, where it only affects English constituents, then as it goes through committee, then only English MPs should have a say on that. Now, at the end of the day, things will come back to the full Parliament and be voted through, but we need to look at actually readdressing the balance, because I can understand naturally the aggravation for some MPs down south, and they've got no influence on health or education decisions in Scotland, that Scottish MPs have that say in England and Wales. So it is looking at addressing the balance, and I think to keep the integrity of the UK, we really do have to look at that.
Next, let's go to Ewan Davidson.
Yes, we need fundamental constitutional reform. We've been campaigning for constitutional reform for over 100 years. I would like to take Ross's point about vetoing the boundary changes. The reason we did that is because the Tories, actually working with Labour, blocked the bill for an elected House of Lords. That fundamental democratic change.
You were to get a referendum.
We'll let you finish, please.
We've got a fundamental problem with our democracy when the upper house is completely unelected, and the fact the two of them worked together to block that bill was disgraceful in my opinion. It was fundamentally undemocratic. I think we need proportional representation, because the fact that the last Labour government was elected with only 35% of the vote is not acceptable in my opinion. And finally, I'm really pleased that the Smith Commission is finally delivering Home Rule for Scotland. It's something we've campaigned for over 100 years, and I think that fundamental delivery powers is a great step.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to go to David, please.
Well, if you wait long enough, it all comes back around again. You know, Oliver Cromwell had a go at trying to straighten it out. I'm in full agreement that there should be an elected House of Commons and an elected second chamber. I've really never understood this thing where somebody gets born with a ermine cloak and he gets to go and sit there, or he happens to be a bishop or whatever it is. It's wrong. The House of Lords, to me, is absolutely wrong. And I'm probably going against the grain of what UKIP's official view on it is, but for me, it's wrong. It needs to be a properly, fully elected second chamber. And the number of MPs and the number of people sitting in the House of Lords, it's a game they play. They promote somebody to the House of Lords because he's the go-to guy to get what you want done. You saw that with Peter Mallinson.
10 seconds.
I want it changed.
Okay, let's go to Brian Davey next.
On English votes for English laws, as you can tell, I'm originally from the northeast of England. It's nothing more than the Tories trying to have an enhanced hold across the north of England. It would just be Tory votes for northern laws. Labour would abolish the House of Lords and replace it with an elected Senate. We devolve more power from Westminster, so we go further than the Smith Commission and devolve the entire housing and welfare budget, the work programme to Scotland, but not just keep it in Holyrood, devolve it out of Holyrood to Aberdeen, so we can run our own affairs better than people I think in Holyrood can. We would also have funding reforms, so big businesses, rich individuals can't buy political parties. But one thing we disagree on is we wouldn't have full fiscal autonomy, which the SNP proposed, which would mean over 9 billion of cuts for Scotland. It would have our entire budget in Scotland depending on how much oil we can sell at what price. So that's one step that we wouldn't take. So on top of those, we wouldn't have another independence referendum, and we wouldn't have a referendum on the European Union. So those are some reforms that Labour would make while maintaining fiscal stability.
Okay, thank you. And Dan Yates.
Yeah, I agree with the point that the House of Lords needs reform. If we're going to have a second chamber to act as a balance of power, it needs to be an elected body and not a place of privilege. PR needs to be developed much further in this country, not just so that the Greens can benefit because we're a smaller party, but certainly because all politics should be about consensus and cooperation and mediation. This yes, no, left wing, right wing, adversarial politics needs to end. There's a whole change of politics and political culture that we need in this country, and PR is going to be the foundation of that, I think. The Scottish Green Party supported independence, but not for nationalist views, because we thought it was the best vehicle for change, for the kind of change we want to see in the UK. We remain an internationalist party, and we will work within a system that for the best change. If it's the UK system that we have to work within, then fine, but it needs to be massive reform in terms of moves towards a federal state, if possible. And really, the transition of power away from Holyrood back to local governments. Council sizes are a big issue at the minute. We don't have small enough council sizes. Aberdeenshire is a huge area. We've got a handful of councillors representing Aberdeenshire. You should know your councillor. You should know him, not personally, but you should be aware of who he is, and you should be sort of encouraged to stand for the council. With great respect to my colleagues here that are on the council, I think people treat the local level of government as a base level isn't very relevant, and it's possibly the most important level of government. We need to change that thinking.
Okay, thank you. Would you like to follow up with your question?
Short of actually picking up individual policies from some of the speakers there, I don't think I'm going to. I'll save that for the next question. But certainly, is there definitely going to be a commitment? Because we've heard federalisation several times, and we've heard reforms from the Labour Party several times in the House of Lords. These things are in your manifesto. Are you actually going to deliver them? And that's the biggest issue, because we hear it all the time. 100 years promising federalisation, no delivery.
I'd like to go to Brian Davey first, and you get 30 seconds to answer.
I think there needs to be more power for Scotland, but there needs to be more power for local communities within Scotland. I think one of the dangers is under a completely federal system, there'd be no UK-wide state pension, there'd be no UK-wide unemployment benefits. And I personally support the pooling and sharing around the UK, so we should tax mansions in the southeast of England to fund hospitals in Scotland. And I support that pooling right across the UK, from the rich to the poor, wherever they are.
Next, I'd go to you and Davidson.
I would take issue that federalisation would mean that pensions can no longer be pooled. In Germany and America, pensions are still pooled in both federal systems, so that can also. on the point of 100 years fighting for a federal UK, I agree it's been far too long, but we've always stuck by that, and we've always stuck by. We want more devolution. We want to see power removed from Holyrood as well down to our local communities.
10 seconds.
We fought for that within the Smith Commission. Other parties didn't want it, but we fought for that within the Smith Commission.
Your next is going to Callum McCabe.
It's a difficult one to answer. How would we deliver it? That depends on how the die is cast and what influence that we have. Clearly, the SNP is not going to be in the position of having a majority government, so it will be in terms of using what influence that we may have in order to get enhanced representation for Scotland. And I think that comes through devolution. I would take issue with the comment that Home Rule has been delivered through the Smith Commission. I think that is stretching the envelope quite extensively to the point where it's basically laughable.
Next next goes to David Lansdale.
Well, I'm a unionist. I love the United Kingdom. And for me, I don't see why that we couldn't have a cross between a federal system, you know, based on the First Minister in Scotland, Ireland, Wales, having a seat in the cabinet
You got 10 seconds.
of the whole UK government, so that the voices can be heard.
Okay, let's go to Ross Thompson next, please.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I go to politics to deliver. I think I've proven that on the council. I get things done. 2, in terms of what was said here about the deal with the Liberal Democrats and us reneging, that didn't happen. They were part of the coalition deal. Was they got the referendum on AV, which they got, but in return they were going to do the boundary changes. They didn't do that. It proves you can't trust a Lib Dem. In terms of what Braden was saying, he spoke about nice words about decentralisation, but under Labour and the Liberals in Scotland we saw centralisation because it's Labour is dominated by Glasgow, and you see that all the time, so you won't get decentralisation through them. And the reason they don't want English votes for English laws is because they don't lose the majority. They're toast in Scotland, they know it. But they know that if Ed Miliband has got any hope of clinging on to power, then it's getting Labour MPs here. That's why they don't want those changes.
Next, let's go on to Dan Yates, please.
In terms of delivering our manifesto policies, we've never really been in a position before to do that, but we're at the cusp now where the party's growing exponentially. We're at 8 times the size we were before. If there was ever a chance that the Greens could come in and have an effect on policy, now's the time. I would just ask people to vote Green. But in terms of the party as itself, it's a very open party. And in terms of the youth dynamic here, it's a young party and it's very accessible. And if you want to come forward and join the party and make policy proposals and really try and sort of dictate policy or influence policy and see that being followed through in manifestos and in implementation, the Green Party is your best option to join and to vote for.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open up to individual questions.
I'm getting older by the minute here.
Do you have any questions?
You must have a question.
I just like seeing Peter run about, so. But for that occasion, I'll have to think of a question as well. So actually, I was hoping to get one more general question, but if it's an individual one, I'll probably ask Mr. Yates from the Green Party. Well, Aberdeen and oil by now are almost synonymous. And well, because of this symbiosis, this city has grown, it's prospered, and so on. And but of course, there is a problem that at some point the oil will run out. Different parties have different numbers, 10 years, 20, 30, 50, 100, let's say. But either way, sooner or later, Aberdeen's basis of wealth and oil will collapse, and I assume that's why you are proposing to move towards renewable energy sources. However, as far as we've seen, renewable energy is enough to supply local community needs, but it's not something that you can export, and not from Aberdeen. You can export renewable energy sources. So I would just like to see what's your alternative plan for Aberdeen so that the city wouldn't go into poverty as soon as the oil runs out. What's your plan? How renewable energy will help out? Thank you.
Okay, Dan, you have 1 minute.
I think there's a lot of options in renewables. There's large-scale renewables which needs a lot of investment, whether it's from public sector or private sector, such as wave and tidal. Those things can't be delivered by the small-scale hydro developments that we've seen the government invest in so far with energy tariff reductions. So there's a role to be played by allowing small-scale development with communities, supporting them in developing their own hydro and biomass heating systems, etc. But there's still a role that the oil and gas industry can play in terms of its skill base, subsea technologies, subsea diving, the supply vessels and the supply support network that Aberdeen exists with, in supporting the offshore development of tidal and wave. It's going to need significant investment, and the attraction isn't there for private investment because there's no clear profit to be made. That's the difference with oil and gas. There's always going to be money to be made at the end of it. But let's not forget, it's a global industry, so there'll be always opportunities for North East oil and gas technicians worldwide. We want to try and keep that skills here and start in parallel investment from private sector in an industry that's going to replace it on the scale of wave and tidal, and try and focus government installation in the local transition to smaller renewables as well.
There's the follow-up your question. Any other comments? Okay, any other questions for any specific party or all general questions? Sure.
I'll go for a general question. Quite a lot of devolved matters keep coming up in pot shots at the Scottish Government. This election is all about what's happening at Westminster. How do the UK manifestos compare with what the issues are in Scotland, for example?
Okay, let's come to you and Davidson first, please.
What do you mean by compare?
Okay, so some issues are devolved and some issues are reserved, but a lot of the time you guys today particularly have been talking about devolved matters. What I'm interested in this election is what are the reserved matters that you're going to change, and particularly all the manifestos for Westminster parties and Westminster elections focus on Westminster issues that are devolved in Scotland. What's the big game changes here?
Okay. We've got 6 main policy pledges, include further devolution of the Smith Commission, tax, further income tax cut, investment in health and education, which you'll know was devolved, but those consequentials, keeping spending at a certain level, means that there's further investment room for the Scottish Government. And additionally, we're saying that we want to see parity for mental health. Again, that funding will go to the Scottish Government to spend as they choose. So although a lot of the issues, maybe in certain parts of the manifesto, are reserved, the spending consequentials are important for Scotland as well.
Okay, thank you. Next, let's go to David Lansdale.
Well, UKIP's manifesto is based on a united kingdom, and I'm afraid I really can't answer your question with regard to what UKIP plans for Scotland, because its whole plan is around the whole of the United Kingdom. So, I'm sorry, I can't answer your question.
Okay, next let's go to Dan Yates.
I suppose the biggest reserved area that the Scottish Green Party have an opinion on is defence and spending, about the UK's role as a defence entity within both the European Union and wider NATO and UN areas. But I think the bigger picture is that Westminster decisions, whether they're reserved matters or devolved matters, the decisions made in Westminster implicate on the spending available to Scotland on devolved areas, especially through the Barnett formula. And the Barnett formula is something that needs to be resolved. I've talked about federalism and moves away and greater powers to dismiss commission, but as long as Barnett exists, there's always going to be this stigma attached to money raised in Scotland not being returned to, or vice versa, too much money going to Scotland in comparison to the tax raised. I think Barnett needs massive revision. It was never meant to be an allocation tool. It was meant to try and bring the spending plans together. But what it's done is that it only changes in terms of English spending rises, Scottish spending rises, and vice versa. It's dangerous that we ignore the Westminster issues that aren't perhaps devolved, because that's going to affect Scottish spending opportunities in the future. So.
Thank you. Let's go to Ross Thompson next.
Yeah, that's a good question, Stuart, because it's natural that when you go around the doors and you speak to people, they want to speak about the local things, and often it's not just about devolved matters, but it's also council matters as well, such as the condition of their street, the number of street trees, etc. And that comes up in the campaign, because as an MP, you need to make sure you're working on their behalf on all these things. I think we've had a better understanding now since the referendum, and it's thanks to the referendum, that people actually seem to be clearer now than what is devolved and what is reserved. And that's been a benefit of that. Now, in our manifesto, you can see there's good old Ruth on the front, who I think's been doing an outstanding job. We have got the NHS mentioned there and other devolved matters. We're very, very clear that these are Scotland, and that further proposals as well will come through in 2016. But we're making clear what our position is on those things. However, at the end of the day, Westminster is responsible for the wider economy, and that's why we're saying it's really important that if you want to continue with more job opportunities and want to see further tax cuts for the hardest working and see that stability, then the only way to do that is by voting Scottish Conservative. So if you have an issue with the NHS, like the crisis in NHS Grampian, you know who's fully responsible is the Scottish Government. So I think it's good that people are now making that distinction of what is Westminster and what is Scottish Government.
Thank you. Let's go on to Callum McCaig.
The SNP is in a position where actually what we put in this manifesto in terms of devolved matters, if the influence we can have on the reserve matters, for the next year at least we can deliver upon those. But in particular on the aspects that are reserved, I think the three key ones for me in terms of that is the overall spending envelope, which we talked about. I'd like to see that bigger. I'd like to see changes in terms of welfare stopped, the bedroom tax abolished, a rollback on the disability living allowance, and changes that are being made there, which I don't think are helping. I think are actually just really quite a crude attack on folk who should be having our support. And the big ticket item at a time like this is why would we spend £100 billion on nuclear weapons? I don't think from a defence point of view they make any sense.
10 seconds.
From a military point of view, sorry, that's the same as defence. From an economic and point of view, in a time of austerity, that's quite frankly off the scale in terms of a stupid thing to do.
Next, let's come to Brandon Davey.
I agree that we should get rid of Trident, but I'm not naive enough to think it will pay for every single thing we want to. It would only save about £167 million a year. About £167 million a year, but whatever the UK government spends has a direct implication through the block grant. It's allocated for Scotland for the Scottish government to decide where it's spent. So things that Labour supports, such as the mansion tax, such as the banker's bonus tax, such as the 50p tax rate, that's raised across the UK and then through Barnett given to Scotland, so it's decided where it's spent. So that additional spending would be under risk if the Tories got back in. But we also have the SNP's absurd position where they'd go to the UK Parliament, vote for a mansion tax, but they don't think any of that money should be spent in Scotland. They don't think any of the money raised in London on mansions or on bankers' bonuses should be spent in Scotland through full fiscal autonomy. We see before about...
10 seconds.
They said about supporting more spending, but the IFS's own independent analysis shows the SNP's plans would have austerity lasting longer than any other main political party.
Can I to respond briefly?
The IFS is independent, and people trust what they're saying unless they're talking about their own party, and then they find deep umbrage with it. Ed Miliband wasn't too keen on what the IFS had to say about Labour's spending plans because they said they overestimated what they were going to spend and they were actually going to cut further. So we can take it with a pinch of salt, I think, what the IFS say, because everyone criticises it when they're talking about themselves, but they take it as read when they're talking about their rivals.
I think we're yet to find a piece of independent evidence that the SNP don't think is wrong. We're yet to find something.
That's politics.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid we've actually run out of time, so no more time for any questions. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I hope you've got a better idea of how you're going to vote in the election next week. Thank you very much.